This is the word of the Lord.
We're talking about the end of the world again. And for Zephaniah, it was most immediately the end of the world that he knew, the Old Testament world. We used to refer to it as the Near East from a European perspective. Now everyone talks about it as the Middle East, adopting the American perspective. Of course, if you're from India or Pakistan, it would be the Near West, and from China, the far or Midwest probably. So it would make most sense to call it just Western Asia, because that's what it is. And it would remind us that the Christian faith has its origin in Asia. So this is the world, and at the time of Zephaniah, we had the largest empire the world had seen up to this time. And I've colored in roughly what that empire covered. And we know that Zephaniah has this in mind because of chapter 2. In chapter 2, we're getting a bit more by way of specifics. We're talking about here the area of the Philistine cities, roughly the Gaza Strip today, as under God's judgment. And then we're talking about the area, what is today Jordan, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And then we're talking about the Cushites. The Cushites are sometimes translated as Ethiopian or really Sudanese now. And they were in charge of Egypt at that time until the Assyrians put an end to it. So they are talked about even in the past, because the Assyrians have already ended the Sudanese rule over Egypt. And then, of course, we talk towards the end of chapter 2 about Nineveh itself. The center of that empire, the Assyrian Empire had various capitals, and at the end it was Nineveh. This was, it had a reputation, still has a reputation for having been a very cruel and oppressive regime. Historians nowadays debate whether they were really that bad, much worse than everyone else, but they certainly took psychological warfare very seriously. These are reliefs that were not produced by some oppressed nations to bring to some war crime tribunal. These are Assyrian reliefs. They are saying, hey, this is what we are doing. We're taking the skin of people alive. If you've seen Game of Thrones, apparently it happens there. I haven't seen it. I don't think it would be very healthy for me to watch. But from what I know, skinning people alive, flaying, so-called, is not ever attested in the whole of the medieval time in Europe. But the Assyrians said, yeah, our business, we do that. They also put people on pails. We've got this motif several times, people paled up here on the right hand, or horses trampling over foreign soldiers. We have that motif a number of times, sometimes with and sometimes without head. So I've used here one example where the enemy soldier is already decapitated. And there are other pictures of the Assyrian army, and then lots of heads lying at their feet. And then the image of the vulture carrying away a human, or on the next slide we're going to see carrying away human remains. That is apparently a symbol, a way of saying, we will show no pity. This was not something that the Assyrians kept secret, dirty secrets. This was their advertising campaign. You better do what we say, otherwise this is going to happen to you. So no surprise that people might want to have that swept away. Whether you're a Christian or not, you think, yeah, that is a reasonable thing to sweep away. So the end of the Assyrian Empire, that is the focus, the immediate focus in the book of Zephaniah. But every end, I said last week, points to the end, the big end, the judgment of God. And therefore, in a second way, we can read this also as anticipating the final judgment. But here is the really big surprise. When we read about Zephaniah, we've read Zephaniah 1 now last week and this week. You will have noticed it's all global, but at the beginning and the end. But in verse 4, we start to talk specifics. I will stretch out my hand against what? Nineveh? Assyria? No, not those no pity guys, against Judah. I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all who live in Jerusalem. And these are the only specifics we're given in this chapter. So this worldwide judgment that looks like a complete global wipeout is actually focused on Judah and Jerusalem. That's the target. Very specific, verse 10. A cry will go up from the fish gate, wailing from the new quarter, and a loud crash from the... We get specific details, addresses. What sense does that make? It's like saying, I'm going to completely nuke the southwest of England. And by the way, I know you live in Oakwood. Who cares where you live if you're completely eradicating everything? If you sweep away all of humanity and the birds and the fish and everything, who cares about the fish gate and the new quarter? Well, God does. Because what looks like a very sweeping judgment is not without discrimination. It's not an indiscriminate judgment. It is also specific. It has a specific target. It's so specific that it even speaks in the image of God walking around the city with a lamp to see where people are. Which is why in some paintings of the prophet Zephaniah, you see him like this, with a whip in one hand for the judgment that he's preaching about, and a lamp in the other hand for God is going to be really careful to find his target. So who's the target? It's God's representatives. When you heard Zephaniah 1 for the first time, you might have thought back of the flood. It's very similar language to the flood, except that this time also the fish perish. Why the flood? Because we, human beings, we are God's representatives. We are made in God's image. And if we mess up, it has consequences for the whole globe. And of course today, with all the environmental catastrophes, we are reminded of that. If humans mess up, it's got global consequences. In the same way, Zephaniah is reminding us here, if the people of God mess up, it's got global consequences. This is serious. And it's not just Zephaniah. We find it in other parts of the Bible as well. Amos begins with a list of different nations being condemned for various war crimes. And then it comes to Judah and Jerusalem and Israel and condemns them for what looks like comparatively minor crimes. You mean not keeping the Sabbath very faithfully is like ripping off pregnant women in war? You mean to say me not being a very faithful Christian, bearing God's name in vain in some ways because I'm acting not like a Christian, is as bad as rape and pillaging? But God is saying it does have those consequences. We've got that motive right into the New Testament, albeit with a twist in 1 Peter 4. Judgment begins with God's household. For it is time for judgment to begin with God's household. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Peter's also talking about final judgment, a final judgment coming already now. And if you're suffering for the sake of Christ, that's the beginning of the final judgment because it's singling you out as a Christian. And that's actually a good thing, Peter reminds them. It's not like in Zephaniah, bad for you, not like being swept away, but it's a good sign that you're on the side of those that God will preserve. Because in the final judgment, what matters is whether you are a true, loyal member of God's household or not. Why is that so significant? Because we are God's representatives. If we who bear God's name do not do so faithfully, how can people know God? So we might be tempted to think, particularly at the current time, that all is going to pot there's evil everywhere, and we just look at others and all the wrong they do. I've come across this week this song by Willie Nelson. I think it goes something like, well, it's all going to pot, whether we like it or not. Best I can tell, the world's gone to hell, and we're sure gonna miss it a lot. Well, we might be tempted to think of just the evil out there. But here's a surprising thing. Going to pot is an expression that goes back at least to the 16th century for being chopped up and boiled for food. Like this, AI-generated image gets you out of copyright. Singing the song yourself gets you out of copyright. So, yeah, all the stuff I do for you. Because in Zephaniah 1:7 it says, be silent before the sovereign Lord. Shut up. Stop what you're doing. Pay attention to what God is doing. What's he doing? The Lord has prepared a sacrifice. He has consecrated those he invited. This is a shocking thing, because the word for consecrated here is not the verbal form that is used for those who are made holy for a period where they can then celebrate the feast, but is the verb form used for those who are permanently consecrated. That means you're the sacrifice. Now, Gabi and I are invited for lunch today, and I hope we're not going to find out that our host will say, and by the way, you're the roast beef. This is what God is saying here. God has prepared a sacrifice, and you are the sacrifice. You, the household of God. So who's the target? Who's the prime target? It's the people of God. And yes, others are in view too. In chapter 2, I've mentioned that. But then we go into chapter 3, and it begins with, woe to the city of oppressors, rebellious and defiled. And you might think it just continues from the end of chapter 2, condemning Nineveh, the great repressive regime there. But it actually continues. She obeys no one, she accepts no correction, she does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. And you realize it's talking about Jerusalem. So the beginning and the end of the book is about judgment on Jerusalem. That is the real target. But we can ask the question of the target also in what is it that God is sweeping away? Well, first thing, false and hypocritical worship. God is sweeping away everything that ignores him and provides fertile grounds for wickedness. Here we read, I will stretch out my hand, I will destroy every remnant of Baal, the fertility god that was worshipped by many Israelites, alleged to be responsible for giving rain. So in a season like this, lots of drought, people would be saying, well, we've got to pray harder to Baal. He's the one who gives rain. And against all who live in Jerusalem, the very names of the idolatrous priests and those who bow down on the roofs to worship the starry host, the sun and the moon were thought to be deities by some worshipped. Those who bow down and swear by the Lord, but they also swear by Molech, or the NIV has an interesting footnote, Hebrew Malcham. Why they say Malcham, I don't know. Malcham means their king. They could just have said Hebrew means their king. Because there's a bit of a kingship motive here. The question is, who is your true king? You might be swearing by Yahweh, the God of Israel, the Lord. You might call yourself a Christian. You might say, worship Christ the King. But who's your real king? I think this is a bit of a motive because also verse 1, which I haven't talked about yet, which is quite fascinating because all this is happening during the reign of Josiah. And Zephaniah is the only prophet who's been given a whole genealogy. Not just Zephaniah, son of Cushi, that would be the normal thing to refer to him, hinting at some African descent, some African blood in his line, Sudanese blood, whatever. Zephaniah, son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, a whole little genealogy ending in Hezekiah, which could even be the king, Hezekiah, but certainly makes us think of King Hezekiah. Now, what's special about King Hezekiah and King Josiah? They were the, by far, best kings that Judah ever had. After Solomon, the kingdom was divided into the northern and the southern kingdom, and the best kings that the southern kingdom ever had were Hezekiah and Josiah. In some ways, you could say they were better, greater than Solomon. Not more wisdom, not more wealth, but Solomon had it relatively easy. He inherited the kingdom from David, a largely faithful king. Hezekiah and Josiah inherited a mess, and they had to institute great reforms and reformations. They were good kings. And so all this threat against the people of God comes at a time of quiet revival. Don't be tempted to think, well, things are looking up, things are getting better here. No, take seriously what God's target is. God is really keen for proper worship. Why? False worship is false witness about God. And today we're tempted to think false witness about God, well, it's no big deal. Because Christians believe one thing about God, Muslims believe another thing about God, Hindus believe another thing, who knows, can't be that important. That's nonsense. By any theological or philosophical consideration, if there's a God, God is the fundamental reality of everything there is. If you get that wrong, you're on the wrong path for everything. This is the most important question. If you get wrong who God is, you can't get right who you are, who your community are, what this world is there for, how you are to relate to animals and to plants and so on. If you get the most fundamental question wrong, you're in trouble. And God is telling us, He's revealed Himself to us, to God's people. So if we, who know God, who bear the name of Christ, if we live and act as if our true security is in money, or if our most cherished love is for our biological family, we're bearing false witness to Christ. How can others then know about Christ? Because they might hear what we say, but they look at our lives and say, well, it can't be that important. It can't be that sort of security, because those Christians, they are still very keen to have a secure bank account. The household of God can't be that important for them, because really the biological family is far more important to them. If we're bearing false witness like that, what chance is there for people to come to know Christ and to be redeemed? So if there's false worship among those bearing God's name, what hope is there for the world? This is why this is part of the 10 Commandments, the top 10 things God is concerned about. Not bearing God's name in vain. I was struck by an article and a sermon I listened to by Simon Guibault, who worked as a missionary in various capacities in Burundi for 20 years. He wrote about his top 3 lessons. Let me read a little bit from that. First one is addressed to an American audience, I suppose, because it talks about dollars. My pastor's 18-year-old brother died in his arms for the lack of $5 to pay for the medicine across the counter in the chemist's. Let's stop moaning about medical care. Burundi is the hungriest country in the world, with 56% malnourished. None of us has had to pray, give us today our daily bread, and really mean it. Let's be deeply grateful for food. We all have access to clean, life-giving water in our homes without needing to walk miles with a jerry can on our heads to get some. What a gift. We can all read and write. We have sufficient clothing. We're free to believe and express those beliefs, be they religious or political. What incredible gifts. Do you realize that these are gifts and not rights? If so, you will live gratefully, and it will totally transform your life. One lesson: be grateful for the many gifts you have day after day. Here's another lesson, getting even more to the bone. During the war, my friend Chrissy saw a man praying with an empty bowl in a refugee camp. She went over and sat next to him. "What's your story, old man?" He told her how he had seen his wife and kids hacked to death and his house burned down. He was in his 80s and had walked 6 days to get to the camp. So now, in his stinking rags in front of her, that was all he was in the world, with the empty bowl. Yet at the end of recounting his horrific tale of woe, he turned to her and said, "Madame Missionary, I never realized that Jesus was all I needed until Jesus was all I had." I do hope that none of us will get to the point where we only realize that Jesus is all I need if everything else is taken away from us. But this is the challenge and the question for us. Do our thoughts and actions reflect our belief, our trust in Christ? Do we live a life of faith? Are there things that could be identified in our lives that are different because we are Christians? First target is false and hypocritical worship. The second is fake and harmful relationships, all those clad in foreign clothes. Hey, what's wrong with a bit of French chic and Italian couture? Yeah. Well, what's wrong with foreign clothing? Well, you've got to remember the ancient world is very different. In the ancient world, clothes were simple, were all locally produced. If you wear foreign clothes, you're not supporting the local economy. Back then, a really big deal. You're not wearing the kind of clothes that God in his law gave his people, with the tassels that remind them that they are members of God's people, that remind them to pray. You're wearing a foreign culture's clothing. You're identifying with a foreign culture. You're effectively saying, I belong to the middle-level elite of the Assyrian Empire, not to you riffraff. You are a member of the people of God, but you find your identity somewhere else, with being in bed with the Assyrians. It's a fake relationship because you're not living out being a people of God amongst others, but you're distancing yourself from them. And it leads to harm. That is, avoid stepping on the threshold, foreign customs being introduced, and then filling the temple of their gods with violence and deceit. 2017, this book came out, The Great Leveler, by a historian who was very ambitious. He wrote this whole story about inequality amongst humanity from the Stone Age to today. How is that for a big picture? And his main argument, his big argument, is that inequality has only ever been addressed through war, famine, disease, revolution, and natural disaster. From the Stone Age to today, inequality never dies peacefully. Now, maybe that tells us if God is interested in equality, we know that he is from his law, and we know that he's not interested in everyone being equal all at the same time, but there's a reset button in God's law every 50 years. Things get redistributed. God is interested in giving equality on a regular basis to all of humanity. So if we are not in the business of creating equality, well, we mustn't be surprised about war, natural disaster, famine, because they are the key things that help reduce inequality. That's the flip side of it. So 2 things that God wants to sweep away: false and hypocritical worship and fake and harmful relationships. In the language of verse 6, those who turn their back on God, who turn back from following the Lord, who maybe pledge allegiance to him with their words but don't live such lives, and those who turn their back on others, who ignore others. These are the targets that God has in mind. Hush. stop what you're doing and consider what God is going to sweep away. Notice how well that fits with the summary of the law that Jesus gives us. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment, and it's the counterpart to false and hypocritical worship. Truly seeking God with all that you are and all that you have. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the counterpart to fake and harmful relationships. And he says all the law and the prophets, the whole Old Testament, hangs on those two things. That's how everything hangs together. This is why we have it here in Zephaniah 1, and then we have it on the lips of Jesus in its counterpart. And this is why, one reason, for example, why safeguarding is so important in church. Looking out for each other, that people are safe and no harm is done to them. That is a fundamental part of what God is looking for amongst his people. Loving him and loving our neighbor. And safeguarding failures, harmful relationships, are some of the fundamental parts that God is going to sweep away. So we've talked about last week, every end points to the big end. And we talked about the big end. Final judgment is an encounter with God, inescapably so. Before the final judgment seat, all of us will need to give an account before God. But this final judgment comes into our world in the forms of little endings. The end of the Assyrian Empire, the end of Western dominance, or the end of the British Empire, or whatever. Even personally, the end of our good health, when we're on a sick bed, or the end of each day, is an invitation to meet with God. And today, we've been given the agenda for that meeting. The agenda is from Matthew 22. Do I love God with all my heart, with all my soul, with all that I am? Or do I really put my security elsewhere, invest my hope somewhere else, trust somewhere else, love other things more? Do I love God with all my heart? And have I lived such a life that looked out for others? Or have I been selfish and idolatrous in my life? That's the agenda for your meeting with God. So as you consider those questions, remember this. My false worship and the harm I have done in various relationships are precisely the things that Christ died for. And my idolatrous and selfish inclinations inside here are exactly the things that Christ redeems me from. So come into that meeting with God in the name of Christ, claiming forgiveness of sins because of the blood of Christ, and pleading with Christ that he would deliver you and me from false worship and harmful relationships. Amen.